Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca. I'm a fish biologist, ichthyologist, also a PhD student specialising or studying the evolution of Loricariidae catfishes, which is plecos. And today I'm going to talk about a topic I hate talking about because it's got some really strong opinions and also a lot of, it's very widely maybe not entirely understood. So TDS and conductivity, the measures you either never heard about or were told not to bother with. And my speciality has largely been with fishes that inhabit maybe waters where this is maybe a bit more relevant than you think. I specialise, being someone that specialises in Loricariidae, and also keeping discus and working with a variety of softwater fishes but also many hardwater fishes, and whether those are even relevant terms. I mostly specialise with the softwater fishes and actually having to remineralise and work on the water a bit more, or so I should maybe. There's a lot of debate to it and there's a lot more to it. So firstly, I should say what I'm talking about. What is TDS? TDS is the measure, or basically the word is total dissolved solids, and a measure of practically that. Conductivity, on the other hand, is one that you don't see so often, probably because it's a little bit more of a word that isn't entirely easy to understand. And as the name suggests, conductivity refers to whether the water is conductive, and therefore it's basically a measure of the ions, the charged particles within the water, charged particles like nitrates. The contribution to both, I can assume, would depend on the actual compounds or elements, and not equally to both. So what actually is within the two could mean quite a few different things, and there's probably there's going to be a whole chemistry element to it. The contribution, they are both measures in effect, I say, of stuff in the water, so minerals, compounds, a whole diversity of different things, and they are related measures, but they are not the same thing. So it's very important, if you're going to be using RO and making your own RO, or just RO in general. There's no debate about that, there should be no debate about that. If you're testing RO quality, it should read as close to zero as possible, particularly in TDS. And you will find TDS meters on quite a few different RO filters as well. RO water, reverse osmosis, removes by forcing the water through a membrane at quite high pressure most of the minerals, compounds, elements from the water that are relevant for measuring TDS and conductivity, and therefore should give that very low reading. The higher that reading, and if it starts to increase over time, that's likely that the cartridges that make up this filter need replacing. And it's a bit like a filter in general. If you're using any chemical filtration, you're getting higher readings, that media is likely to need replacing. RO though will not give us lower of a reading, usually anyway, as RODI, which is reverse osmosis deionized water, so that's even more in depth. And then also distilled water will move even more. Distilled water you'll never really need to use in the aquarium trade, it's more of a, I guess, a laboratory thing, or if you're going to be using, I don't know, for ironing. But both of these waters are used a lot in reptiles, and I think in reptiles they understand it even less. But I guess that there's a whole lot more to it. So maybe this is the main time you'll come into contact with these two measures, TDS and conduct. So for those adamant refusal to accept TDS or conductivity, when researching parameters of wild fishes, a problem might occur. Scientists often measure the conductivity, TDS, and maybe pH of where these fishes come from. So particularly the exact area of a river, of a lake, of a water body in general. They use those two measures to say to what the parameters these fish come from. They will not be using, for a lot of people, they might be sad is they won't be using GH, KH. Like even pH is quite rare, usually conductivity. So it's really difficult to sort of work out, but I'll go into that in a second. But why do they use this? It's probably, I assume these are probably the most detailed measures that you can quickly take. And they measure everything rather than an individual parameter. And by measuring everything, I think an aquarist can, if they're gonna measure every individual parameter, aquarists can miss a lot and misinterpret a lot. So it's kind of very important, I think, that they're gonna be using conductivity, but also if you're inferring a GH or a KH, even a pH from a TDS or conductivity measure, you might be totally misunderstanding water parameters in general. So is it important, like GH and conductivity? It's really difficult to actually answer, and the answer though is definitely not no. They are important and useful measures. They're only quick to take, so there's no harm. You're not going to be sitting there for ages waiting for a result. And freshwater is complex with a wide range of minerals and compounds that make each habitat unique. All measures we use largely ignore this anyway, and it doesn't help that we largely think in terms of hard water or soft water, which are very vague. And even maybe looking at jumping up the wrong minerals, the wrong compounds, when really we should be thinking of maybe mineral rich and mineral poor, and maybe what minerals. But not also not just minerals, maybe nutrients, oligotrophic versus eutrophic, or mesotrophic. Most water bodies, even where they are high in minerals, are likely oligotrophic, so they are very low in phosphates and nitrates as the sort of, or nitrogen compounds, very low nutrients that can be used by autotrophs particularly, so plants, algae, stuff like that. Although nitrates do contribute to TDS and conductivity, it's kind of like them, although they do, you still might get a very high conductivity, very high TDS in places like Lake Tanganyika, Lake Malawi, a lot of that Rift Valley, which is kind of based on that whole geology of the area. Also even Central America. It doesn't mean that they're going to be very high in nutrients. They are oligotrophic. And a lot of the fishes we get in captivity come from very low nutrient areas, although their TDS might vary. But it's a lot more complex than I think people think, because freshwater is complex. There's so many more minerals, elements, compounds that are involved. Thinking even just calcium, but carbonate is one. A lot of these aren't going to be measured anyway down most people's sort of systems of measuring, and I think by avoiding these two you're ignoring so much more, and so much more that doesn't get tested for. So this is where it comes into, if you want soft water fishes, or if you've got very soft water, there is the problem of remineralization. So if you're using RO, and this is the main problem with rainwater, and it's a lot more complex than people think, and I won't entirely go into certain elements of it because I don't think there's enough scientific sort of theory or evidence behind a lot of arguments that I don't really want to discuss, where there is no science to discuss sort of either way. But remineralization. So the remineralization problem, when you've got very low mineral content in your water, you might want to remineralize your water up. Why might you do this though? There's a big thing that's often forgotten, is that fish actually do uptake quite a lot of elements from the water itself. So calcium being a main one, they do also take it from their food, but also from the water itself. I think it is exchanged through the gills, I'm not entirely sure, but they do take up a lot of vitamins and minerals through the water. There will obviously be an adaptation to different mineral contents within the water. So therefore they're going to be adapted, particularly I would say for this either low or high conductivity, particularly for their own health, their long-term health. And this might be why you see particular issues maybe with some organisms, particularly like snails, mollusks, that have to grow their shell. If they're kept in parameters that don't allow them to do how they take up their food naturally. I'd assume that fishes that live in low mineral content are evolved to actually uptake nutrients or minerals, vitamins, etc. from, well, not vitamins, it would be more elements from the actual food if they're found in lower mineral contents, because they're not going to be able to get it from their food, and this from the water, and the same with the snails. Hence why you don't really see those erosions in those South American snails, because they're going to be found in water very low in calcium, very low in a lot of other minerals. So they're going to ideally try and get it from their food in a lot of different ways, and snails are brilliant when it comes to getting food in different manners. Whereas in hard water there's probably the other problem. There's a lot, so they're going to probably mostly, there's no need to maybe aim for it so much in their food and maybe go for it more in the water, or there's a balance between the two, and it will depend maybe on the availability of each. The complexity of water does mean that different fishes might be evolved to different levels of different minerals and compounds and elements. So take some waters might be really high in carbonates but really low in calcium, and the fish have over a long period of time adapted for somehow dealing with the high carbonates but trying to get calcium elsewhere. And it's not just that, maybe magnesium and other things, where although a lot of minerals they might just be taken from their food anyway. But even with people, you'll see where if you're only using very pure water, it can cause issues in the gut, because there's so much you are actually uptaking element and mineral wise from the water. So I'd assume the same with fishes. If they're all going to be taking it from the water to some level, if there's nothing in the water they're going to be most likely aiming for food. So this is really important just to recognise, and it's not just calcium, carbonate, there's magnesium, there's probably zinc, there's everything, and they all want different levels, and some waters can move exceptionally high. And how would they manage with it being too high? I've not even researched that, and it would be interesting to research how they manage with, because fishes do have issues with extremely hard water. There has been like recognised issues with livers potentially. So fishes out of those sort of zones might have issues internally and physiological differences because they're evolved with particular mineral contents. But we're even, so you might say, well, carbonates are important, but then you're missing everything else if you're only going to focus on carbonates, and I'll get onto that in a bit. But there's so much more to it, and freshwater is so diverse. You've just got to look at the actual bedrocks at times and seeing maybe that's what is going to feature a lot in the water, and there's not measures of every water body. So Northern Hemisphere tends to be the most well studied, Europe, North America, probably like China and Japan also, have been heavily studied with their water bodies, and likely the whole mineral content has been studied, and you can kind of infer what the fish are adapted to. Is this important? Will it make a fish live longer? Potentially, we don't know. No one's testing it out, no one's trying it out, no one's really thinking about it. But there is so much more to it. Freshwater is so diverse, and you do get that real exception with some waters being very unusual. Take Lake Tanganyika, has a higher KH, so a higher carbonate load than the general hardness, and that's really difficult to replicate. But I think TDS is extremely important. So the remineralization problem. Let's get back to it. If you want to remineralize your water, a lot of people, when they're not looking at TDS and told it's not important to look at TDS, they think, if I want to remineralize, I'll remineralize just focusing on what the measures people say are important. And there's one measure that people always focus on, and that's KH, or carbonate hardness. Forgetting that carbonate alkalinity exists, that's a whole other argument that I think really needs looking into. But there's so much backing for KH that no one's going to discuss against KH for carbonate alkalinity, even though that they are related measures. They're related maybe a bit more closely than TDS and conductivity, but they do mean very different things, and they are often very confused, but like the two terms used interchangeably when they shouldn't be. But when remineralizing and you're only focusing on one parameter, not the spectrum, you're going to miss out a whole load of different elements and compounds. And when only focusing on KH, a lot of people use bicarbonate of soda or KH up sort of minerals, not really minerals. And this only shoves one parameter up, which is totally unnatural. And whether this will actually affect the fish, particularly given that it's so rare in nature that it happens, Lake Tanganyika being particularly one of those where that KH is so high, you're also forgetting that there's a whole load of other minerals, vitamins that fishes will use for their general health. And therefore, I think with remineralization, there's the other aspect of there are ones that do contain a bit more, but then they forget one measure. And this is why when remineralizing, I say if possible use tap water. The idea is that tap water should contain a wider spectrum of, or dechlorinated tap water should contain a wider spectrum of elements and minerals. And if you're cutting it with, so I usually use 50% tap water to RO, start with that. And then if it's particularly high on the TDS measure, I use 80% RO maybe. But why is TDS important here? Well, firstly, you're missing out half the spectrum, so you might end up with a sky high other parameters as well, but you're missing out the sort of general spectrum. And it's quite good to have that general spectrum of TDS and conductivity. So I always work via, well, ideally tap water, ideally using those minerals that do contain that wider spectrum of salts or minerals. Salts is just a term, it's a chemistry term. It doesn't mean it's marine water that you're adding in. Salts is just such a spectrum of different compounds. But I really think it's very important to think the bigger picture rather than just focusing on one parameter. And you see much an instability almost when people do focus on that one parameter, not thinking about the big picture of different parameters in general. And yes, because TDS is that big picture, you might not see the, or conductivity, you might not see the individual parameters, but there's no test kits for those individual ones. And people aren't testing for those individual ones anyway. And it's very difficult to sort of think about, but it does feel very, this modern anti-TDS, anti-conductivity does feel very new. And it's not something I ever really focused on. I always remineralize my water using TDS and conductivity, and then going for minerals that have the widest spectrum and remineralizing depending on what fish I kept. I generally found that many fish will breed at sort of 180 ppm TDS, and I've lived and worked in many different places, so used RO with and mix it with tap water in many different sort of water sources. Some extremely high some extremely low. I think the other problem is with liquid test kits is they can be equally just as unreliable as a lot of people will say about other test kits. And I've tested KH test kits that have said 0 when there is no way that water has 0 carbonates in, because it is getting lime scale like anything. But I think there's a lot more to it, and when there's no one, that is something that people aren't arguing why or questioning why. I think conductivity and TDS is really useful. I have never had an issue remineralizing with it, but I have seen issues if you're only going to use that bicarbonate of soda, KH up products, because you're only focusing on one parameter. The other issue with if you're going to use minerals for remineralization is that they do take time to dissolve, so you're getting that lag. So that's the same for KH products. You're getting that lag, and you'll measure, say you measure an hour later, it won't give you the true value till much later on. And that can cause real swings, and that's why I've seen swings. Another aspect of it is thinking about nutrients, and I want to do a video about nutrients in freshwater habitats. But anyway, thank you for watching. If you like my videos, please comment, like and subscribe. I might try and include a few papers on different mineral contents of different water bodies for reference, but only ones I've found anyway, just because otherwise I could sift through so much. So measures of different water parameters in different water bodies that we often get our fishes from. Anyway, thank you for watching.